Greetings sailors and welcome to the new operation that's come with patch 076, Operation Cherry Blossom, which is based on the battle for Empress Augusta Bay, and that actually makes it the first operation that is directly based on a naval engagement. We had of course Dunkirk, which was a tie-in for the film Dunkirk, and of course that was based on the evacuation, but that wasn't really a naval battle in the same way that this is a naval battle. And then Hermes was extremely loosely based on the operation to move French gold to America before the fall of France, but again not actually based on a naval battle. So that makes this a first in that regard. It also is a first in that it's the first purely tier 8 operation, and that comes with a couple of caveats in that it is restricted to the allied nations because of the nature of it being a more historically based battle, which, you know, makes sense, but it's also restricted to cruisers only. So there's not that many ships that can take part. You've got Americans, you've got the Soviets, you've got the French, and of course the British, and I am here in fact in my Edinburgh. And of those nations, for tier 8, it's more light cruisers than heavy cruisers. And honestly, I found light cruisers were the better ships to take in this one overall. You can still do something with heavy cruisers, but light cruisers just give you more reliability in terms of actually being able to do damage, because you're faster firing, and it's a lot easier to hit the destroyers in this one with the light cruisers, because there are going to be a lot of destroyers. There are also a fair few cruisers in play, but again, with the light cruisers you can hit those pretty much equally as hard when they're giving broadsides at the kind of ranges that you're fighting at than you can with the heavy cruisers. So overall, I would definitely recommend your light cruisers over your heavy cruisers, but you can still play heavy cruisers and not be a complete drag on the team. It's not like playing a Japanese destroyer in most of the tier 6 operations, for example, where you're just going to really not be contributing much. So you start off with rescuing the transport ships, which is not that difficult to do. You take care of that initial group, and then you have to do the same thing for the shore-based regiments. And basically, you have to stop these Myokos from shelling them, and you kind of have to give these Myokos some priority. If you let them shell the shoreline too long, they will destroy your allied forces. So you can't be too complacent. You can't all suddenly turn your guns on the other ships that have come down from the north. It's okay if one or two people are switching fire to those destroyers and cruisers that have showed up, but if everybody's ignoring those Myokos, then that's going to be a problem fairly soon. You'll notice, by the way, it's basically all tier 7 destroyers and cruisers in this one, Japanese ones, aside from there being an Otago that you'll have to tackle later on. Technically there are also some Zows on the map, but they don't do anything. They're just there for flavour. You can pretty much ignore those. You don't get a chance to shoot at them at any point, and they don't shoot back at you. So yeah, that just seems to be entirely because why not? And the Zao, of course, is a ship that didn't actually exist, so I'm not even entirely sure why it's here, but never mind. Somebody just thought it would be a nice addition, I guess. So you're seeing here a couple of new things as well that I didn't mention that are also in this operation, and one of them is the star shells, which are illuminating various points on the map, as you can see right now. If you drive through them, you are basically spotted, even if there's no enemies nearby. And otherwise, the other thing that's going on is that it's nighttime, except that's not new exactly. I think this is basically using the mechanic that we had in the Halloween mode, and it's essentially like a storm. There's restricted visibility. The thing that is kind of new is that what's going to happen is, you know, this is the pre-dawn hours. It gets lighter and lighter as the operation progresses, to the point where it then becomes basically daylight by the end. So this isn't the entire operation, which is, I mean, it's not that dark, all things considered, but it might make it slightly more interesting later on if there was still this Well, not interesting. Interesting in a bad way. It might make it a bit too difficult later on if there was still this heavily restricted visibility. But it does somewhat prove the idea of night battles being a viable thing. At least in operations. I'm not sure we would want this in random games necessarily. You can, just as a note by the way, if you have radar, if you're in a Chapayev or one of the American ships, it will function just the same as if you are radaring someone in smoke, or if you are radaring somebody in a storm. It'll extend your vision range and they won't be able to see you in return. And that can be somewhat useful in this early portion, but it's probably more worth keeping it for the actual smoke. That leads me on to talking about consumables, because in this one, having ships with basically the full range is quite useful. Edinburgh's smoke, I'll say this right now, you will see me use it in this one, but I felt smoke was of somewhat limited use because by the time you've put down the smoke to start firing at things, people have probably already fired torpedoes at you, so it's a little bit risky. There was another round I did with the Kutuzov where I did try and put down some smoke and ended up getting killed because I tried to stick around and use the full duration, and people had already put torps in the water towards me, so by the time I was able to see them and get moving, it was just far too late. Hydro, defensive AA and radar, however, are all extremely useful in their own ways. Hydro is kind of obvious. I don't need to tell you why that's useful. The defensive, you're going to see why that's useful in not too short a time. Although there's also some help from the 2 AI carriers that have turned up, and possibly the destroyers as well. I'm not sure if they are AA spec Fletchers, but they might be. Or they might be semi-AA spec. They might have at least a defensive, even if the captains don't have skills. But yeah, there are going to be a whole bunch of planes around and many torpedoes to dodge. So the defensive is also very useful, and just having a good AA captain is very useful generally. And lastly, radar. Well, that's possibly the one you won't need too often, but there are times when actually being able to pop a radar to deal with enemy smoke is quite handy. The destroyers generally don't try and smoke until the enemy destroyers, that is, don't smoke until they are damaged or low health, or they've had an engine knocked out or something and they're stationary in the water. They don't just go around laying smoke screens willy-nilly, in my experience. Otherwise there would be a lot of smoke. So if you have a choice between radar and hydro in a slot, for example, I don't know if there are any ships that do actually, but the Baltimore, that gets a choice between radar and like a catapult fighter, right? Or am I completely making that up? I don't know, but in that case, you know, the catapult fighter might perhaps be a bit more useful. The Cleveland, though, that doesn't have to choose. The Cleveland is a very good choice, irrespective of the fact there is currently a mission for playing the Cleveland and the Baltimore as well, but I've mostly seen Clevelands. It's just very useful because it can take both and doesn't have to sacrifice one for the other, and they are both such important consumables in this. Although the Edinburgh, as you'll see, doesn't do too badly either, just because it can dodge fairly well, but you absolutely have to keep your head on a swivel. So anyway, I think all the cruisers generally have something going for them. So whether you have to, like, if you're playing a ship that you have to choose, it's kind of up to you which you take. Personally, I think hydro slightly edges out the defensive, just because defensive AAs tend to have a long cooldown on them, and the part where the planes are attacking you, it's just a couple of waves basically. By the time they're making their 3rd or 4th sortie, they tend to be fairly depleted by that point. It might even be a fixed number of sorties they make against the players. I'm not entirely certain. But you're not going to have to deal with planes for the entire rest of the operation. You just get a couple of waves and it gets a bit interesting, and then you go back to just having to deal with the surface combatants. Now, onto the surface combatants themselves. Well, this is the second phase of the operation. We're pushing forwards to attack the airfields, and you then have to deal with all of these Myokos and all of these destroyers. The spawned marked spawned. The marked Otago has spawned at this point, as you can see, and that you need to kill. I should also note, and you've possibly noted this from the in-game chat as well, one of the allied carriers has a repair circle that you can use. It's not going to be around for the entire rest of the operation, but if you've taken any torpedoes during that first part, you can go and heal there pretty easily, because it's a pretty strong heal. It's in fact the strongest heal of any of the operations so far. It gives you 300 health back per tick. So even if you've taken a torpedo in the side and are just about hanging on, it can be pretty easy to get back to full health. You're not going to be sailing around and having to worry about being focused as the low health ship going into this, unless you've managed to get yourself really out of position and just couldn't get to the carrier to heal in time. You'll note the Otago's path, by the way. It looks like it's trying to head off map somewhere around the 1 line, but it doesn't actually do that, to my knowledge. It just sails down to the 1-2 line and then kind of turns back, but generally hangs around in that area. And so if you haven't managed to kill it, it is possible to go chasing off after it, but that of course means peeling somebody away from the main group. So you want to try and kill it as quickly as possible, because it is worth a secondary star. So there's my smoke going. Just been pelting things with all of the AP, and you'll note there's plenty of broadside cruisers to shoot at, but they do awkwardly turn an angle sometimes, which is very unsporting of them. Yeah, it's the destroyers that'll get you if you're unwary, because there's just so many torpedoes around, and of course the cruisers are all putting out torpedoes as well. And it actually can be, I'm going to get caught flat-footed here, it can be sometimes difficult to deal with all the planes coming at you, and if you are too far forward, or if everybody else is you know, over on one side and you've made yourself an isolated target, then you can end up with a situation where the AI squads will try and cross-drop you, and it all gets very nasty. I've seen people die that way. So you have to be a bit careful about straying too far from your allies, basically. But if you try and either stick together as a group, or maybe form 2 groups to the west and east sides of the entrance to this harbour area, then that can work too. Just as long as people aren't completely splitting apart and scattered all over the place. Because I've seen that in 1 or 2 rounds, and it doesn't end well. Hell, I had one round where we had fully 3 of our cruisers hanging back where the carriers have stopped, just sat in the repair circle trying to hit things from a distance. And I think they were all Clevelands as well, so they weren't doing it very effectively. And there's no way you can hit the bases from back there. The Kutuzov might be able to, but basically every other cruiser can't. And they were just sat there, everybody else was getting beaten up, and by the time they pushed out and went forward and started doing things, it was almost too late, but we still managed to just about squeak a 4-star, even so. But we came down to literally the last 30 seconds in that one, which was far closer than it needed to be. So we're at about the 5-minute mark, and or 5 minutes left rather, and I feel like you should be pushing towards the second base at this point. The first base is relatively easy to get, there isn't any obscuring terrain in the way, but as you can see, the location of the second base is such that you have to press forwards and clear that little headland before you can get any kind of field of fire on it. And all the while there are still AI ships spawning. But the ship spawns seem to be on a timer, I think. It's not trying to keep a certain number of ships on the map at any one time. So I think it just spawns certain ships at fixed intervals. And so it's possible to get far enough ahead that you basically clear out the enemy ships in between the spawns. But if people aren't doing the damage effectively, or you've lost too many people by this point, then it is possible just to become overwhelmed by the bots. But in this case, we've managed to quite successfully deal with just about everything, and we've whittled it down now to just a few ships at a time. So I've got myself into position to fire at the airbase. I've used one of my smokes, and at this point I encountered a little bit of an issue in that, well, won't see it here, but for some reason, like the first couple of salvos is fine, and I'm hitting where I'm aiming more or less, and then it gets a bit weird about it. And the terrain indicator comes up, and suddenly, just because of the nature of how it works with aiming and being locked onto things or not being locked onto things, it's not putting my shells where I'm actually aiming. And maybe I just needed to be a little bit further north than this and not be firing over that little bit of terrain that's in the way between myself and the base. But yeah, this was a little bit odd. I just couldn't hit that, you know, massive base area that was only a couple of kilometers from me. And somehow the shells were all just going completely along. I don't know if you have to hit specific areas of the base to do damage, by the way, but it seems like you just have to aim at the buildings generally, and that will knock off the hit points. So there's one unique reward for that. 3 stars gets you the cherry blossom symbol along with 10 of the camos. The 5th star is as usual a day premium, and 4 stars is the usual commander XP and free XP. So all in all, a fairly nice set of rewards, although nothing too special. The XP, nearly 2100, which was nice. The most damage I actually did at any point was in a Kutuzov game with nearly 200k damage, but that's because other people weren't really pulling their weight. But you can get decent damage out of this, you can get decent XP out of this, although I don't think you can really farm planes in quite the same way unless you took a full AA setup. But there are just so many cruisers around, and the carriers are using their AA and their planes as well, that the air kills, in my experience, have been a lot more spread around the team generally. So it's not like Operation Hermes where you can set out to hoover up a lot of plane kills and get a big boost to your XP that way. The actual economy side, 169k profit. You're never going to lose money on this. It's an operation, but it's not a hugely profitable one, I don't think. You know, it gives an okay amount of reward, although you might possibly get better profit rewards. And well, in fact, you know, for that amount of damage in a random game, I would have definitely gotten a better amount of profit than that. So just in terms of grinding cash, I'm not sure this is a great operation, but in terms of grinding XP, as you've seen, you can actually do quite well for yourself. So that's Operation Cherry Blossom, which is, all things considered, pretty straightforward. There's basically no randomization, you've got fixed area spawns, you've got fixed objectives, there's no kind of shifting secondary objectives or anything of that nature, and although I've seen some fairly dismal efforts from teams, most of the wins have been 5 stars that I've had. I've had one win that was 4 stars so far between playing yesterday on the NA server and today on the EU server, and everything else was either a 5-star or a loss. And a couple of those losses were because we actually just ran out of time because people weren't pushing hard enough for the final bases, or there were just too many AI ships left alive because we lost too many people by that point. So it is entirely possible to lose at this one, but it's quite easy to get a 5-star if you get a decent enough group. It doesn't even have to be an amazing group of players, it just has to be a good enough group of players. And just in terms of general skill ceiling, I think this is not too difficult an operation at all. So hopefully you've found this little guide useful, and if you have, you can do the usual things below, and of course, as always, stay tuned for more.